The morning mist clung to Brooklyn Heights like a shroud over the Continental Army's fortifications, but General George Washington felt no comfort in its concealing embrace. It was late August 1776, and the largest expeditionary force in British history had assembled in the waters around Staten Island, their white sails dotting the horizon like predatory birds circling wounded prey. Washington knew that everything the Revolution, the dream of independence, perhaps even his own life hung in the balance of what was to come across the Narrows. General William Howe commanded over 32,000 troops, the largest army Britain had ever deployed to the New World. His brother, Admiral Richard Howe, controlled a fleet of more than 400 vessels, transforming New York Harbor into a British lake. The brothers had spent weeks methodically positioning their forces, and now they were ready to deliver what they hoped would be the killing blow to the American rebellion. Washington paced the ramparts of Fort Putnam, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the enemy positions through his spyglass. The intelligence reports had been troubling. The British were not merely planning an assault on Manhattan, but a complex multi-pronged attack designed to trap and destroy the Continental Army entirely. The weight of command pressed heavily on his shoulders as he considered the impossible mathematics of the situation. His force of roughly 19,000 men, many of them untested militia, faced a professional army nearly twice their size. The strategic importance of New York could not be overstated. Control of the Hudson River would effectively cut New England off from the southern colonies, while the magnificent harbor would provide the Royal Navy with an unassailable base of operations. More critically, a decisive defeat here could shatter American morale and bring the rebellion to a swift conclusion. King George III and his ministers in London were counting on it. As Washington studied the terrain, he could see why the British had chosen Brooklyn as their battlefield. Long Island's western edge offered multiple landing sites for amphibious operations, while the network of roads leading to Brooklyn Heights provided several avenues of approach. The heights themselves, rising some 100 feet above the East River, commanded both the river crossing to Manhattan and the harbor beyond. Whoever controlled this high ground would control the fate of New York and perhaps America itself. The Continental Army's defensive position appeared formidable at first glance. Major General Nathanael Greene had spent weeks preparing elaborate fortifications along Brooklyn Heights, complete with redoubts, trenches, and artillery positions. However, Greene's intimate knowledge of the terrain had been lost when he fell ill with fever just days before the expected British assault. His replacement, General John Sullivan, was brave but unfamiliar with the complex defensive arrangements. According to historical records preserved in the Library of Congress, Washington's greatest concern was not the strength of British arms, but the loyalty of the local population. Long Island contained numerous Loyalist sympathizers who could provide Howe with detailed intelligence about American positions and movements. The general knew that in warfare, information was often more valuable than gunpowder, and he feared his enemy possessed far too much of both. As the sun began to set on August 26th, casting long shadows across the defensive works, Washington could sense that the decisive moment was approaching. Tomorrow would bring either victory and hope for the cause of independence, or catastrophic defeat and the likely end of the American Revolution. The trap was set, but who would emerge as hunter and who as prey remained to be seen. The pre-dawn darkness of August 22nd, 1776, was shattered by the rhythmic splash of thousands of oars. Cutting through the calm waters of Gravesend Bay, General Henry Clinton, commanding the British advance force, watched with professional satisfaction as wave after wave of flat-bottomed boats carried his troops toward the Long Island shore. The landing at Gravesend had been executed with clockwork precision, catching the American outposts completely by surprise. Clinton's advance guard of 4,000 men encountered minimal resistance. As they splashed ashore, the few American sentries who spotted the massive amphibious operation fled inland to spread word of the invasion. But it was already delayed. By sunrise, 15,000 British and Hessian troops had established a secure beachhead, with more arriving every hour. The largest military landing in North American history was proceeding exactly according to General Howe's carefully crafted plan. The choice of landing site had been brilliant in its simplicity. Gravesend Bay offered protected waters and gentle beaches perfect for landing heavy equipment and artillery. More importantly, it placed the British force well south of the main American defensive positions, giving Howe room to maneuver his superior numbers. The local Loyalist population proved invaluable. providing guides who knew every road, path, and farm track across the island. Washington received word of the landing while reviewing fortifications on Brooklyn Heights. The message, delivered by a breathless courier whose horse was lathered with sweat, confirmed his worst fears. The British had not merely probed American defenses, but had committed their entire army to the assault. Within hours, enemy patrols were ranging as far north as Flatbush, barely 5 miles from the main American positions. The Continental Army's response revealed both courage and confusion. General Sullivan ordered forward elements to take up positions along the ridge line that ran across the center of Long Island, hoping to prevent the British from advancing directly on Brooklyn Heights. However, the hastily established defensive line was stretched thin across nearly 6 miles of heavily wooded terrain. Sullivan's men, many of them Pennsylvania and Delaware troops who had never fought together before, struggled to coordinate their movements across such difficult ground. The British, meanwhile, demonstrated the advantages of professional military training. Howe divided his force into 3 distinct columns, each with specific objectives. The Hessian troops under General Leopold Philip D. Heister would advance up the coast road toward the Gowanus Heights, drawing American attention to the west. A second column under General James Grant would move against the American left flank, near the village of Bedford. The main attack, however, would come from an unexpected direction entirely. Clinton had spent days interrogating local loyalists about possible routes through the American lines. Their information revealed a narrow country lane called the Jamaica Pass, which wound through the heavily forested hills at the eastern end of the American position. Remarkably, this crucial gap in the American defenses was guarded by only 5 mounted officers. It was exactly the kind of tactical intelligence that could determine the outcome of an entire campaign. Contemporary accounts from British officers, as documented in the Royal Military Archives, describe the meticulous preparation that went into the flanking maneuver. Clinton's men would march through the night, using local guides to navigate the treacherous forest paths in complete darkness. The plan required perfect timing and coordination between all 3 British columns, but if successful, it would place the main British force directly behind the American lines. As evening approached on August 26th, the stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in American history. The British had landed successfully and positioned their forces for a devastating attack. The Americans held strong defensive positions, but remained largely ignorant of their enemy's true intentions. In the camps of both armies, soldiers cleaned their muskets and checked their ammunition, knowing that tomorrow would bring the test that would determine whether the United States of America would survive its infancy or perish before it could truly begin. The die was cast, and there would be no turning back. The darkness of August 26th was absolute, broken only by the occasional glimmer of hooded lanterns. As General Henry Clinton's column of 10,000 men began their secret march toward Jamaica Pass, the British had spent the day in apparent inactivity, allowing American scouts to report that the enemy seemed content to consolidate their beachhead. It was exactly the impression General Howe wanted to create while his most ambitious gambit unfolded under cover of night. Clinton rode at the head of the column alongside his most trusted local guide, a loyalist farmer named Samuel Willis who had lived on Long Island his entire life. Willis knew every creek, every stone wall, and every muddy track that crisscrossed the island's interior. More importantly, he understood that the Jamaica Pass narrow defile through the wooded hills represented the key to the entire American defensive position. Control that pass, and the Continental Army would find itself trapped between the East River and a superior British force. The march tested every aspect of British military discipline. 10,000 men had to move in complete silence across 6 miles of unfamiliar terrain, navigating by starlight and maintaining formation despite numerous obstacles. Sergeants passed whispered commands down the line, while officers struggled to keep their units together in the impenetrable darkness. Any significant noise could alert American sentries and doom the entire operation. At the American outpost guarding Jamaica Pass, 5 Continental officers maintained their lonely vigil, unaware that they stood directly in the path of the war's most crucial flanking maneuver. Colonel Samuel Miles of the Pennsylvania militia had positioned his small force based on the assumption that the heavily wooded terrain made a large-scale attack through the pass impossible. It was a reasonable calculation that failed to account for British determination and superior organization. Washington spent the night moving between defensive positions, trying to divine British intentions from fragmentary intelligence reports. His scouts had detected movement in the British camp, but nothing suggested the scale and audacity of Clinton's night march. The American commander's greatest disadvantage was his lack of reliable intelligence about enemy movements. Unlike Howe, who enjoyed the support of numerous loyalist informants, Washington was fighting largely blind. The British advance guard reached Jamaica Pass shortly after midnight, moving with ghost-like silence through the forest. The lead elements, composed of light infantry trained for precisely this type of operation, approached the American outpost with professional caution. What they discovered exceeded their most optimistic expectations. The pass was defended by fewer than a dozen men, and the Americans showed no awareness of the approaching danger. Clinton immediately signaled for the main column to accelerate their advance. The capture of Jamaica Pass occurred without a single shot being fired. British light infantry surrounded the American position in a matter of minutes, taking the startled sentries prisoner before they could raise an alarm. Colonel Miles and his men found themselves staring down the barrels of dozens of muskets, with no choice but surrender. The key to the American defensive position had fallen into British hands without bloodshed. By 3 in the morning, Clinton's entire force had passed through the defile and was deploying in the rear of the American lines. The flanking maneuver had succeeded beyond Howe's most ambitious expectations. The Continental Army, stretched along a 6-mile front facing south toward the expected British attack, now faced the nightmare scenario of being struck simultaneously from front and rear by a vastly superior enemy force. Historical documentation from the British Army's official records, housed in the National Archives in London, reveals the meticulous planning that made the night march possible. Every aspect of the operation had been rehearsed, from the order of march to the distribution of ammunition. British quartermasters had even arranged for the artillery to follow special routes that would minimize noise while transporting heavy guns through the forest. As dawn approached on August 27th, Clinton positioned his men for the decisive blow. Signal guns would coordinate the attack, with all 3 British columns striking simultaneously at the moment of Clinton's choosing. The trap that had been days in the making was finally ready to spring. The Continental Army, still facing south in anticipation of a frontal assault, remained completely unaware that their most dangerous enemies were now positioned directly behind them, waiting for the signal to attack. The fate of American independence would be decided in the next fifth morning of August 27th, 1776, dawn clear and humid, with a light breeze carrying the scent of salt marsh across Long Island's rolling countryside. At precisely 9 o'clock, the boom of British signal guns shattered the peaceful morning air, and the most decisive battle of the early Revolutionary War exploded into violent life. General Howe's carefully orchestrated trap was springing exactly as planned, with devastating consequences for the Continental Army. The first blow fell on the American left flank, where General James Grant's column of 5,000 men advanced against the village of Red Lion Inn. The Delaware and Pennsylvania troops posted there fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered more than 2 to 1. Colonel Samuel Atlee's Pennsylvania Musket Battalion held their ground for nearly an hour, delivering volleys that temporarily staggered the British advance. But professional discipline and superior numbers eventually told. Grant's men swept through the American positions like a red tide, driving the defenders back toward Brooklyn Heights in growing disorder. Simultaneously, the Hessian column under General D. Heister launched their assault on the American center near Flatbush Pass. The German mercenaries, resplendent in their blue uniforms and tall brass caps, advanced with mechanical precision despite withering fire from American defenders positioned behind stone walls and farm buildings. Major General John Sullivan had positioned his best troops here, including seasoned Maryland and Delaware Continental soldiers who understood the importance of holding their ground. The fighting was savage in close quarters, with both sides taking heavy casualties. But the masterstroke came from Clinton's flanking force, which had spent the dawn hours positioning themselves in the rear of the American lines. At the sound of the signal guns, 10,000 British troops swept northward like an avalanche, catching the Continental defenders completely by surprise. American units that had been facing south to meet the expected frontal assault suddenly found themselves under attack from behind. Their carefully prepared positions rendered useless in an instant. The collapse of the American left wing was swift and catastrophic. General William Alexander, known as Lord Stirling, commanded the Continental forces in this sector, and he immediately recognized the mortal danger facing his command. With British forces advancing from both front and rear, his only hope lay in a fighting withdrawal toward the heights. However, the marshy ground near Gowanus Creek created a natural bottleneck that would trap hundreds of his men unless someone bought time for an orderly retreat. Sterling made the decision that would define his military legacy, taking personal command of the 1st Maryland Regiment, approximately 250 men from Baltimore and Annapolis. He launched a desperate counterattack against Grant's advancing column. The Marylanders, many of them educated gentlemen who had volunteered from patriotic duty, charged into the teeth of superior British numbers with the fury of men who knew they were likely marching to their deaths. The Maryland counterattack achieved something close to the impossible. For precious minutes, Sterling's men held back an entire British brigade, allowing hundreds of other American troops to escape across Gowanus Creek. The Marylanders paid a terrible price for their valor. Fewer than 10 men from the regiment would survive the day unwounded, but their sacrifice prevented what could have been the complete annihilation of the Continental Army's left wing. Contemporary British accounts, preserved in regimental histories held by the British Museum, describe the ferocity of the Maryland attack and the profound respect it earned from professional soldiers. General Grant himself would later write that he had never seen colonial troops fight with such determination and skill. The sacrifice of the Maryland Regiment became one of the war's most celebrated examples of American courage under fire. By noon, the American position had become untenable across the entire front. Sullivan Center was crumbling under Hessian pressure, while Clinton's flanking force had cut the main road leading back to Brooklyn Heights. Thousands of Continental soldiers found themselves trapped in a shrinking pocket, with the East River at their backs and British forces closing in from 3 directions. The revolution that had begun with such hope 15 months earlier appeared to be approaching its violent end. Washington, watching the disaster unfold from his command post on Brooklyn Heights, faced the most critical decision of his military career. He could attempt to reinforce his collapsing lines, risking the remainder of his army in a hopeless battle, or he could accept defeat and try to salvage what remained of the Continental forces. Either choice carried enormous consequences for the cause of American independence. The hammer had fallen, and it seemed nothing could prevent the destruction of the Continental Army. The afternoon sun of August 27th cast long shadows across a battlefield littered with the debris of American hopes. General Washington stood atop the ramparts of Fort Putnam, his telescope trained on the chaos unfolding below as his army disintegrated before his eyes. The carefully planned British assault had achieved everything General Howe could have desired, transforming what should have been an orderly defensive battle into a catastrophic rout that threatened to end the American Revolution before it could truly begin. The scale of the disaster became apparent as streams of Continental soldiers fled toward Brooklyn Heights in complete disorder. Entire regiments had ceased to exist as organized fighting units, their survivors scattered across the marshy ground between Gowanus Creek and the East River. General Sullivan himself had been captured while trying to rally his broken center, falling into British hands along with hundreds of his men. The Delaware Regiment, pride of the Continental Army, had been virtually annihilated, with Colonel John Haslett among the missing and presumed dead. British and Hessian forces pressed their advantage with professional efficiency, methodically rolling up the shattered American lines. The woods that had concealed Clinton's flanking march now served as hunting grounds for British light infantry, who pursued fleeing Americans with relentless determination. Prisoners were taken by the hundreds, including many officers whose loss would cripple the Continental Army's already thin leadership structure. The human cost of the defeat was staggering. American casualties mounted into the thousands, with entire companies wiped out in the space of a few hours. The Maryland Regiment's heroic sacrifice had saved hundreds of lives, but at the cost of virtually ceasing to exist as a military unit. Similar scenes played out across the battlefield as American units found themselves surrounded and forced to surrender or face annihilation. Perhaps more damaging than the immediate casualties was the psychological impact of such a complete defeat. Many of the Continental soldiers were experiencing combat for the first time, and the shock of being outmaneuvered so thoroughly by professional European troops shattered their confidence in American military capabilities. Desertion, already a problem in the Continental Army, threatened to become an epidemic as men concluded that resistance to British power was futile. Washington faced a commander's nightmare as reports reached him of the scope of the disaster. His intelligence network, such as it was, had failed completely. The British had achieved total tactical surprise, executing a complex multi-column attack with the precision of a European battle. Worse yet, the enemy was now positioned to complete the destruction of the Continental Army in a matter of hours. General Howe, observing the battlefield from his command post, had every reason for satisfaction. The battle had unfolded exactly as planned, with British forces achieving all their initial objectives ahead of schedule. American resistance was crumbling across the entire front, and the possibility of capturing Washington's entire army was becoming increasingly realistic. A complete victory here would likely end the rebellion and restore royal authority throughout the colonies. The geography of the battlefield now worked entirely in Britain's favor. The Continental Army was trapped on Brooklyn Heights with the East River at their backs, and British forces controlling all land routes to safety. The heights themselves, while strongly fortified, were surrounded and could be subjected to a siege that would force American surrender within days. Washington's position had become hopeless from every tactical perspective. However, Howe made a decision that would profoundly influence the course of the war. Rather than pressing his advantage with an immediate assault on the American fortifications, he chose to implement a formal siege. The British commander, perhaps mindful of the casualties suffered at Bunker Hill, decided to reduce the American position through artillery bombardment and systematic approaches, rather than costly frontal attacks, according to military historians. Analysis found in the Quarterly Journal of Military History, Howe's decision reflected both the strengths and limitations of 18th century military thinking. The formal siege was doctrinally correct and would minimize British casualties, but it also gave Washington precious time to consider his increasingly limited options. Every hour of delay improved the Americans' chances of avoiding complete catastrophe. As evening approached, Washington called his remaining general officers to a council of war. The agenda was brutally simple: how to prevent the complete destruction of the Continental Army and, with it, any hope of American independence. The situation appeared hopeless, but Washington had not survived the French and Indian War by accepting defeat easily. Somehow, against all odds, he had to find a way to salvage something from the wreckage of his army. The fate of American independence hung by the thinnest of threads, and time was running out. The night of August 29th, 1776, would forever be remembered as one of the most audacious military evacuations in history. As a providential fog rolled in from the East River, General Washington put into motion a desperate plan that represented the Continental Army's last hope for survival. The British Army, confident that their trapped enemy had nowhere to flee, settled into siege positions while the Americans prepared for what military historians would later call the most crucial retreat of the Revolutionary War. Washington's Council of War had reached a unanimous conclusion: the army must evacuate Brooklyn Heights immediately or face certain destruction. The British controlled all land routes to safety, leaving only the treacherous waters of the East River as a possible escape route. The plan was fraught with danger. 9,000 men would have to cross nearly a mile of open water, under cover of darkness, while maintaining absolute silence to avoid detection by British sentries less than a musket shot away. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Regiment became the unlikely saviors of American independence. These Massachusetts fishermen and sailors possessed the nautical skills necessary to navigate the tricky currents and shifting winds of the East River in darkness. Glover's men had spent the day quietly assembling every available watercraft, from naval longboats to fishing sloops, creating an improvised fleet capable of ferrying the entire army across to Manhattan. The evacuation began at 10 o'clock under cover of complete darkness. American sentries maintained their posts along the fortification lines, keeping campfires burning and continuing normal patrol routines to give the impression that the army remained in full strength. Meanwhile, regiment after regiment quietly filed down to the ferry landing, where Glover's boats waited to carry them to safety. The logistical challenges were enormous. Artillery pieces weighing thousands of pounds had to be moved silently across muddy ground, then loaded onto boats without creating noise that would alert British sentries. Wounded soldiers required special handling, while supplies and equipment that couldn't be transported had to be destroyed to prevent their capture. Every aspect of the operation demanded perfect coordination and discipline from troops who had been badly shaken by the previous day's defeat. Nature seemed to conspire in favor of the Americans. The fog that rolled in during the early morning hours was so thick that British sentries could barely see beyond their own positions. The wind, which had been blowing strongly from the southwest, suddenly shifted to the northeast, allowing boats to make faster passages across the river. Even the tide cooperated, providing favorable currents that helped speed the evacuation. Washington himself remained on Brooklyn Heights until the final boat, personally ensuring that every Continental soldier who could be saved was safely across the river. Contemporary accounts describe him moving through the abandoned fortifications like a ghost, checking every position to make certain no wounded men had been left behind. His presence gave courage to the rear guard units who maintained the deception. Until the very last moment, the British discovered the evacuation only after it was too late to prevent it. Dawn broke on August 30th to reveal empty American fortifications that had been completely abandoned during the night. General Howe's carefully planned siege had captured nothing but abandoned earthworks and a few pieces of artillery. Too heavy to move, the Continental Army had vanished like morning mist, leaving behind only the debris of their hasty departure. British officers expressed grudging admiration for the skill and audacity of the American retreat. Captain Frederick Mackenzie of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers wrote in his diary, preserved in the British Army Museum, that the evacuation demonstrated a degree of military skill and organization that we had not previously credited to the colonial forces. The retreat had been executed with precision that would have impressed European military professionals. The escape transformed a catastrophic defeat into something approaching salvation for the American cause. While the Continental Army had suffered terrible casualties and lost enormous quantities of supplies, it remained intact as a fighting force. More importantly, Washington had demonstrated that American forces could learn from defeat and adapt their tactics to survive against superior opposition. However, the strategic situation remained desperate. The British now controlled New York Harbor and had demonstrated their ability to outmaneuver American forces at will. Washington's army, though preserved, was demoralized and reduced in strength. The Revolution had survived its first major test, but barely, and the challenges ahead seemed even more daunting than those that had been overcome. The impossible had been achieved, but at enormous cost, and the war was far from over. The September sun cast harsh light on the sobering reality facing the Continental Army as it regrouped on Manhattan Island. While Washington's masterful evacuation had saved his forces from complete annihilation, the Battle of Long Island had inflicted wounds that would take months to heal. The Revolution had survived its closest brush with extinction, but the price of that survival was becoming increasingly apparent as reports filtered in from across the newly declared states. The casualties from the battle were staggering by American standards. Over 1,000 Continental soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured, including some of the Army's most experienced officers. The loss of General Sullivan to British captivity was particularly damaging, depriving Washington of one of his few competent subordinate commanders. The Maryland Regiment, whose heroic sacrifice had enabled hundreds of other soldiers to escape, effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit, with only 9 men answering roll call after the battle. More troubling than the immediate casualties was the psychological impact of such a comprehensive defeat. Desertion rates soared as soldiers concluded that resistance to British power was hopeless. Entire militia units simply melted away, their members returning to farms and businesses rather than face the prospect of another encounter with professional European troops. Washington's effective strength dropped from 19,000 to fewer than 14,000 men within a week of the battle. The strategic consequences were equally severe. British control of New York Harbor provided the Royal Navy with an unassailable base for future operations, while the Army's demonstrated ability to outmaneuver American forces encouraged loyalist sentiment. Throughout the region, General Howe had achieved everything he had hoped for except the complete destruction of the Continental Army, and that failure would prove more significant than anyone realized at the time. The British victory reverberated throughout Europe, where foreign observers had been watching the American rebellion with keen interest. French ministers, who had been secretly considering aid to the Americans, concluded that the colonials lacked the military capability to sustain a prolonged war against Britain. Spanish officials reached similar conclusions, effectively isolating the United States diplomatically at the moment when foreign support was most desperately needed. In London, news of the victory was received with enormous satisfaction by King George III and his ministers. Lord North's government had gambled enormous resources on the New York campaign, and Howe's success seemed to vindicate their strategy of using overwhelming force To crush the rebellion quickly, plans were immediately set in motion for follow-up operations designed to complete the pacification of the rebellious colonies before winter. However, the battle's most important consequence may have been its effect on General Washington himself. The near-catastrophic defeat forced him to confront the reality that European-style conventional warfare played to British strengths, while highlighting American weaknesses. The Continental Army could not hope to match British discipline and organization in formal battle, but it might survive through mobility, flexibility, and the strategic use of terrain. The lessons learned at Long Island would influence American military strategy for the remainder of the war. Washington began developing the tactics that would eventually prove successful, avoiding pitched battles when possible, striking isolated enemy detachments, and using the vast distances of North America to stretch British supply lines beyond their limits. The defeat that had nearly destroyed the Continental Army paradoxically provided the foundation for its eventual victory. Contemporary analysis, as documented in the Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society, suggests that the Battle of Long Island represented a crucial turning point in American military thinking. The romantic notions of citizen soldiers easily defeating professional armies were replaced by a more realistic understanding of the challenges facing the Revolution. This sobering assessment ultimately made the Continental Army more effective by forcing it to adapt to the realities of 18th century warfare. The British had won a tactical masterpiece at Long Island, demonstrating superior planning, coordination, and execution. Their victory was so complete that it should have ended the American Revolution before it could gain momentum. Yet the Continental Army's survival, achieved through Washington's brilliant evacuation, ensured that the war would continue. The rebellion had been bloodied but not broken, and the lessons learned in defeat would eventually contribute to ultimate victory. The Battle of Long Island had indeed been Britain's knockout blow, but America had somehow managed to remain standing. The fight for independence would continue, though the path ahead remained treacherous and uncertain. The price of survival had been paid in blood and suffering, but the cause of liberty endured, waiting for better days and more favorable circumstances to achieve its ultimate triumph. The Revolution has survived its darkest hour, but only barely, and the memory of how close it had come to destruction would haunt American leaders for years to come.